Hey comrades, bienvenidos compañeros. Welcome to this week's episode of Red Library, a political education podcast for today's left. Thanks for tuning in. We have for you today part 2 of our Revolutionary Politics in Central and South America series. It's been a little bit since we did part 1, which was Open Veins of Latin America by Eduardo Galeano. But we're back. We're here to dig back in, and I am very, very excited for this one because we have our most excellent Comrade / Professor Noah de Lissovoy returning to the show. Him and I are going to talk through a very influential, a very essential book on critical pedagogy, on Marxist education, on liberatory struggles for human emancipation by Paulo Freire called Pedagogy of the Oppressed. On a personal note, the reason why I am so excited for this one and am especially thankful and humbled that Professor / Comrade Noah was able to make time to come onto the show and talk about it with us today is because I initially found out about Noah's work by researching the very same book by Paulo Freire that we're going to talk about today. So it's a little bit of coming full circle, if you will. All right, y'all, I think you're really going to enjoy this one. But as always, please continue to support Red Library in any number of ways so we can keep this project healthy and running strong. You can subscribe to the show on iTunes or any other podcast catcher you use. Please keep giving us those reviews, either 5 stars, 1 star, 3 stars. Drop us a few lines, let us know why you either love or hate us. It is a great privilege to be hated by one's enemies. I'm tempted to do some sort of evil laugh there, but I'll withhold it for today. Please head over to Patreon, throw us a few bucks, support our show materially. Big shout out to all of our new patrons. You may notice that the quality of my audio recording right now may be a little bit different, and that is because I'm very happy to say we were able to get some new mics, get some new equipment upgrades because of our most excellent Comrade patron support. So join the ranks. We're going to be dropping our first patron exclusive episode probably in the next week after this one comes out, and that's going to be me, Comrade Alex, and Comrade Commissar Don talking about the horror films of Ari Aster, Hereditary and Midsommar, and giving our analysis, our hot takes, our cold takes, our lukewarm takes, anything we got. And I'm sure it's going to be chock full of politics and theory and culture. So for as little as $3 a month, you can get access to all the exclusive episodes we're going to be throwing out starting this month. All right, remember to follow us on Twitter, shoot us an email, like the page on Facebook. All that stuff is in the show notes, so make sure you check those out every single week to find extra readings, references, and all of the links for that stuff. We really hope you enjoyed this week's episode, our part 2 of our Revolutionary Politics in Central and South America series, and we'll see you back here afterward. Comrades, welcome to this week's episode of Red Library. We have an excellent, a very brilliant returning guest, Comrade / Professor Noah de Lissovoy, back on the show. Hey Noah, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, and I'm glad to be here with you.
I'm very glad you're back in the Red Library with us. We do have a good number of books here, so it has that actual library feel. Well, you're here for part 2 of our Revolutionary Politics in Central and South America series, which we just got started a few weeks ago. And we're here to talk about a book that is very near and dear to my heart. I think it's near and dear to yours as well. So what are we here to discuss today?
We're going to talk about Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire, the Brazilian philosopher and educator.
Yeah. So a very, very influential book. I was doing a little bit of homework before we decided to record today. I saw something that his work is cited, I guess, in general academic research more than Marx and Foucault, which is quite an accomplishment.
Yes, highly cited and read by folks all over the world.
Maybe just to start, kind of like we did the last episode you're on, we always like to just set the context a little bit. So maybe if you could tell us a little bit about your relationship to Freire's work, his influence, the impact that he's had on education and philosophy and Marxist thought, whatever else comes to mind.
Sure, yeah. I think that I first became aware of Freire's work. It was through this book in particular, through friends of mine who recommended it to me, and I remember reading it and being sort of astonished.
Same here.
You know, but then it wasn't until a little bit later when I got into education as my occupation on a full-time basis, and I started to become an activist and also interested in different ways to think about teaching and curriculum, that I became associated with folks involved in this movement that is often called critical pedagogy in North America. That's often the term that is used of folks who are interested in understanding teaching and learning in an educational in a political frame and in an activist frame, and as a project for humanization and revolution, really. And then once you're in those circles, you know, Frary is everywhere, and in fact, really is the kind of founding figure within that particular tradition. The folks that I was in contact with, and the well-known scholars and activists in North America in the critical pedagogy tradition, really were absolutely deeply influenced by Frary and were students of his, and so I got deep into his work as a result of that. He's had a global influence in education and beyond, and he was an adult literacy educator, but his influence has extended, you know, beyond adult education to literacy generally, to philosophy of education, beyond education to theology, to philosophy, to sociology, to other kinds of practical work, including social work, as we were discussing earlier, and in all kinds of political organizing and social movements. His work has had a tremendous impact on social justice movements and revolutionary movements throughout the world. So he's a very interesting figure in that he is deeply respected and widely read in the university as a scholar and theorist, and also read by folks outside of the university who are interested in making real change and transformation.
You had mentioned that there's this way that for Frary, he's combining this revolutionary Marxist, activist social justice work, which he was very involved in on the ground, combining that with an approach to education and adult literacy. And it always makes me think about how often, whenever we think about education as an institution, as a practice, I always feel that we inherently fall back on ideas of Foucault or Louis Althusser, that the role of education is primarily to socialize people into the structures of capital, to teach them to be good subjects that are going to consume and uphold the status quo and participate in the systems as we find them. It seems that Frary's power has always been to revolutionize education for revolutionary ends, to change the way that people, individuals, can use that education to take control of their history again, because their ability to create history has been taken away from them for decades, generations, millennia, even.
Yes, that's absolutely right, and that's a great observation. I mean, he certainly shares the analysis of folks like Althusser, or in the U.S. context, the very famous sociologists of education, Bowles and Gintis, who really understood public education from a Marxist and critical perspective as a process of social reproduction and absorption of, labor power and human consciousness into the machine of capitalism. And in a way, right, he shares that underlying analysis, but he has a vision of transformation, and it has to do with his positionality, right? Not just as a philosopher, but as an educator on the ground, and also as a revolutionary in the Brazilian context, right, who was involved in struggle. And so it always has that emancipatory horizon, and that's really the emphasis, and that's why it's so enlivening for students, because it's not just his work, a depressing account of how screwed up everything is, but
we have enough of those.
Right, but not just a sort of vague injection to be hopeful, right? But a concrete basis for hope, and a methodology, rather, I should say, for philosophical and practical work for transformation. And that has to do with his theoretical basis, to his philosophical basis, which starts from a kind of ontological understanding, you could say, in which human beings are oriented oriented in this fundamental way toward liberation, right? In what it means to be human, we have a kind of historical vocation in the direction of liberation. And so in that sense, there's a sort of deep optimism is not quite the right word, faith perhaps, that has to do with the underlying analysis. So that oppression is a kind of deviation and a distortion, historical distortion of, human being. And it also has to do with a kind of Marxist understanding of a dialectical movement towards towards liberation and revolution, right? So in that sense, I think you're right on that. It's critical and also the empowering vision.
So just a couple of maybe concrete points about Frary's life. So he was Brazilian, and I guess he was doing his work in Brazil prior to the military junta, and I think it was 1968, and then ended up having to flee, and either he went to Chile right after that or went to the States, but also did some work in Chile. So what should listeners know about this way that this concrete practice really informed a lot of the theory that he has?
Yeah, so he was already hard at work and a well-known educator in Brazil prior to the military coup of 1964, actually.
Oh, 64, yeah.
And he did go into exile to Bolivia and to Chile for a few years, and then made his way to the United States. Pedagogy, the Oppressed came out in 68, and then in English in 1970 for the first time. And then he did work all over the world, really. Eventually, in Africa, in Europe, eventually returning to Brazil after the Workers' Party took power there to actually be Secretary of Education in Sao Paulo. But he did work with different communities around the world. So his thinking was always in the context of concrete educational and social projects, and his theory came out of those kinds of engagement. On the other hand, those practical projects were always deeply informed by his theory and his philosophical investigations and understanding. And for him, of course, those things weren't separated. So he challenges in some ways a very common dichotomy that we have, especially in North America, between theorists and practitioners, and he denounced that kind of separation.
Yeah, he strikes me as one of the best examples I always think about whenever I try to understand does an actual physical embodiment of someone who's engaged in practice look like. And Frary has always been the person that has been near and dear to my heart to say, well, this is kind of what this looks like whenever you really are very directly involved in this sort of dialectical process of engaging in practice, but also deep theoretical investigation and sort of shifting and changing how they inform each other through your actual political revolutionary work.
Absolutely. He denounced, armchair philosophers who simply offered prescriptions from afar, right, without, following through on the implications of their analysis or being informed by practical work on the ground. On the other hand, he was equally harsh on sort of, so he called the first position verbalism, a sort of thinking and philosophizing detached from practical context. On the other hand, he also denounced what he called the activist position that, was concerned to simply sort of tick off different practical and policy goals in a more progressive sense, or say the revolution among left sectarian groups, without deep reflection on the work and informed by philosophical and theoretical engagement. And, we fall prey to both of those tendencies, I think. And so he's a good example in that regard.
And maybe before we dive into the content of the book itself, since this is part of our Revolutionary Politics in Central and South America series, it seems that anti-colonial struggle is also a really core feature of Frary's thought, his work. So maybe if you could speak to the importance of the anti-colonial aspect of his project and this book itself.
Yes, absolutely. So I think you can see, and he's very synthetic in his work and brings together lots of different traditions. The anti-colonial political moment and anti-colonial theory is very important in his thinking and in his writing, and Pedagogy of the Oppressed in particular. And so the work of Frantz Fanon, the Martinican revolutionary and psychoanalyst who did work in Algeria and wrote Wretched of the Earth and many books, was very influential for Frary. And of course, it was a moment of anti-colonial ferment globally at that time that had a huge impact on him and inflected what is really a Marxist understanding in its fundamentals in a very particular direction, right? Sort of away from a rigid and formal framing in terms of class struggle to a more flexible, fluid, oppressor-oppressed framing, which are the terms he uses, that has to do, which can then respond precisely to things like the situation of colonialism and anti-colonial struggle. So he's very interesting in that regard, in that he's a thinker within a revolutionary tradition and within the Marxist tradition, but he inflects that thinking in very particular directions that have to do with the political moment and the situation of, being in Latin America and the centrality of the struggle of peasants and rural folks in the context he was working in. So in similar ways to other, revolutionary movements in Cuba, in Africa, having to rethink some of the tenets or familiar assumptions of revolutionary Marxism.
Yeah, it almost strikes me that he's in this sort of spiritual lineage with Mariategui, and thinking about the way that Marxism gets adapted and flexibly utilized in these particular situations to create this kind of new way of theorizing and developing revolutionary struggles.
Yes, I think so.
Well, I think that's the best introduction I could imagine to his work. So where should we dive in and get started on this thing?
Well, there's so many different possible starting points. I think maybe a couple of the key themes and concepts it might be worth touching base on, with attention to, always the question is, how do they speak to us now, and what are the implications, for the current moment, which was always what he wanted people to do with his work, right? I think there's a couple of sort of key things to note here. First of all is that he is situating political and pedagogical work within this broad sort of historical existential horizon of conflict between humanization and dehumanization, right? So as, activists or as teachers, we are situated in that horizon and must be sensitive to it and responsible and accountable to it if we're really to do our work right. That is to say, are we going to participate in the historical project of liberation and humanization or not? And he, as he always insisted, we can certainly choose not to, but it's not just a sort of making the wrong choice in some narrow political sense for him. It's actually a betrayal of our humanity and of what it means to be an educator, or what it means to be a cultural worker, right? So he's asking of teachers, for instance, a much deeper sense of their work, a much more philosophical, much more theoretical, much more ethical kind of understanding of what it means to be an educator, and that you have to make your choices against that background. So that's one thing. The other key thing is the idea, and this is on its face a pedagogical point, but it has much broader implications, which is his critique of what he called banking education and his argument for what he called problem-posing education, a dialogical kind of education that was resisted the notion that students were vessels to have information deposited into them. Instead, we should have a kind of education that invited students along with their teachers to collaboratively investigate urgent and important problems that they were living, right, as the basis for for academic work proper, or for literacy work proper. And so that's a educational philosophical shift that also has political implications, because it means that as activists or as organizers, similarly, we cannot start from a set of slogans or a set of solutions or answers that we simply ask people to absorb, but rather what it means to be revolutionary and what the knowledge is that will guide us forward has to be collaboratively constructed through dialogue with regular folks.
I'm wondering too, it almost seems to me that Frary's idea is that to teach is inherently to engage in a political act that demands a choice, whether something is going to be participating in a process of liberation or it's not. And that's sort of the challenge that he's posing, is to say, if you're engaging in pedagogical work and teaching, whatever that looks like, this is part of the choices that you have to make.
Exactly. And that's why it has such an impact on folks who read him in education, because it's a very different perspective than what people generally get. You think, oh, I'm going to learn to be a teacher, or I'm going to be, an educational researcher, or you're doing this work in the field, and I have to learn the skills I need to learn, and I have to be trained in the core competencies. And then here comes along this guy that says, you know what, you can't even do that. You can't accomplish that work successfully unless you confront very basic philosophical, political, ethical problems that are posed by the historical moment you're living. In other words, it's an ethical commitment that is demanded of you. You can turn away from it, but that's a choice. That's a choice you make not to step up to what you're called to step up to. So it's a challenge, and it's a very, always a relevant thing to recall for educators in the United States, where teaching, especially here, is so depoliticized and also deprioritized and looked down upon. And educators are sort of considered, teachers are supposed to sort of just follow the rules and the script, and it's a technical and so he's deeply challenges in this. The teachers are intellectuals, they're moral actors, they're political actors, and they have to take that seriously. Which also means elevating their sense of the work that they do. On the other hand, the other side of that, of course, as many critical educators have pointed out, and particularly I would say Henry Giroux, who was one of the students of Paulo Freire.
Yeah, I was wondering if his name was going to come up.
Well, is the emphasis on politics as pedagogical. That is to say that on the other side, we have to understand that the political sphere has to engage with people in a dialogical way. And that's true for the left as much as everybody else, right? That if we're serious about making change, democracy doesn't wait till the revolution happens. The revolution is right now, in the moment of building a dialogical relationship with folks and struggling together in collaboration for transformation.
I'm smirking as I'm hearing you say this, because something just dawned on me in this sort of dynamic process of making meaning through us talking about this together, that whenever we decided to start this podcast, it was very clearly focused on political education. It was seeing that there isn't this separation between politics and educational work or cultural work, which I think you mentioned is a beautiful way to describe it. I'm sort of now realizing that maybe the whole reason we're doing this in the first place was because of reading Giroux, reading Frary, and always having that close to my heart, that if we want to build some sort of movement that can in fact engage in some process of revolution, social revolution, whatever that might look like, this educational piece has to be there. It is so vital, and it's also very easy to almost dispense with it or to operate on the banking model. I'm also thinking about how often there's this idea that whenever we're engaging, if at all, in this educational piece of political work, that it's essentially us just giving people the knowledge. Here's the things to read. Here are the slogans. And that's really what we're doing. That's the extent of the educational work. And it strikes me that, without realizing it, I think I've always had a different model from reading this book, and it changes how I engage in political work.
Yeah. And, there's different views on this. There are Marxists, for instance, who disagree with, this is certainly not, for instance, a Leninist sort of model for a kind of political work. Not that there isn't any overlap between those two thinkers. But I believe very much that it's important not just in an ethical sense, right? It's important not just in one's relationship to those with whom one works and in solidarity with whom one works, but it's a deeper kind of conviction in that Freire's really suggesting, I think, that, say, in the political sphere, it's not just that you should sort of be in dialogue with people to move the agenda forward. It's that the agenda doesn't exist. And not only the agenda, but the knowledge itself that supports that agenda can't come into being without that dialogue, which is to say that regular folks, students in the educational context, are already possess an indispensable knowledge for the project of liberation, and that in that collaboration and in that dialogue between educators and students, or between cultural and political workers and participants, that there is a collaborative construction of the knowledge and the program for an organization or a classroom, right? So it has that kind of epistemological level that he was always interested in, that there's this deep curiosity about, what knowledge is and what is true that we can't decide ahead of time.
Well, I assume that's also a big part of this liberatory aspect of educational work, is this way that you're granting that the people sitting across from you, whoever that is, they have this innate liberatory, humanized sort of existence and being, and that they can create knowledge. In some ways, there is going to be no agenda or revolutionary knowledge unless they're actively co-creating it with you in the process of the work itself.
Yes. So you were asking earlier about, the anti-colonial kind of context.
Yeah.
And if this is very similar in some ways and very much influenced by, for instance, Frantz Fanon's argument about the process of, anti-colonial revolution in Africa, where he traced a process whereby, the elite nationalist intellectuals are thrown back on their heels, and the most committed ones end up sort of by accident getting to know the real folks, especially out in the rural areas, and their thinking being completely changed, which is also, right, the story of the Cuban Revolution. And Che's and Fidel's whole innovation, which allowed for that, was the communion with the forgotten folks in the rural areas. And so Frary is making a similar argument that regular people, have a basic knowledge and understanding of their situation and an instinct and a humanity that is, essential, indispensable, and, instruct in their own right. Now, it's always dialectical, right, in this work. The other side of it, of course, he was also equally adamant that didn't mean, he's sometimes misinterpreted in this direction, it didn't mean that everybody knows everything already and that the teacher is supposed to just sort of sit back. I mean,
yeah, sure.
He believed that a teacher who possessed certain kinds of insight and cultural capital, perhaps in another kind of jargon, had a responsibility to share that and to challenge folks' understandings in a more critical direction, to open up a deeper and wider understanding of the world for all involved in dialogue, right? He's not saying, well, everybody knows everything already. There's a process of education that's crucial, and a process of becoming what he calls conscientization, of becoming more deeply aware and agentic in one's surroundings. It has to do with exposure to certain kinds of information and to a certain kind of challenge and opportunity for dialogue that a critical educator or organizer can make available.
One thing that jumps to mind here, and this might be getting a little bit into the weeds, but I can't help but think about the idea of the Mast Line from Maoist types of thought. And this idea that go to the masses, we hear what they have to say, we hear their concerns, and then we add this level of political analysis and then return that to the masses and see if this resonates with them in terms of what their general political vision is or what they would need to, overturn some situation of oppression. If you could, how would you compare Frary's ideas to something kind of similar to this process, or do you see it having maybe some different nuances?
Well, I think there's connections. I mean, he's within a family of sort of revolutionary traditions and models for organizing. And there's a connection. There's a recursive process in his methodology, for instance, for constructing curriculum that involves an investigation of a particular context or community and dialogue with folks to uncover key issues, then a sort of refinement of those issues by the educators involved in the project to some core themes and questions, then coming back to folks in more focused groups to clarify those further, to finally sort of refine a set of curricular materials that crystallize key themes, and then engaging people on a wider scale in dialogical culture circles, as he called them, to investigate these themes and to critically analyze them. Now, I would say there's a difference in that for Frary, even though it's very much a kind of revolutionary thinking that is concerned to expose structures and processes of oppression, where those show up and the way that they're lived by people is nothing that that the educator can decide ahead of time, right? So he was always committed to from the beginning of a project, working in solidarity with folks and in collaboration to uncover what are the key generative themes, as he called them, that are important to people, and also in a sort of historical sense are the nodes of the key antagonisms that will move things forward. But the intellectual can't know that ahead of time. And in that sense, it's a little more, I think, open of a conception of that kind of revolutionary organizing, and really, emphasizes again the sort of pedagogical dimension of it, which is so central.
Yeah, I think that's super helpful to think about too, because there's this way that pedagogical element is really emphasized. And I've always felt that in the sort of Maoist framework, it's much more sequential. It's these very clearly defined, step-by-step process. But I've always had the impression in hearing you talk about it that with Frary, it's sort of much more dynamic. It is much more dialogical. That word seems to really catch me about a key distinction between the two.
Yeah, and he actually lays out a quite clear methodology of a number of steps, as I just sort of summarized in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and it's kind of the middle of it, a kind of section that people often skim over. But it's actually very instructive. Yeah. And in other words, it's sort of, you could say in pedagogical terms, it's the tension between organization and fluidity, or in political terms, right, the old tension between spontaneism and whatever you want to call it, professionalism, or the vanguardism on the other side.
Rigid bureaucratization.
Yeah. So, but the point is that even at the very beginning of the process, it's taking place in collaboration with regular folks where they are, and in a spirit of openness and humility to learn. So that's what's so interesting. He talks about the student-teacher and the teacher-student, that one is always, even if those are not the same thing, but it's to say that the teacher is always learning, and that the student is also always teaching in sharing their knowledge and insights. And so I think that conception, again, though it belongs to this larger family of revolutionary thinking, also challenges it in some basic ways, because he really asks, the organizer or the educator to, and he was clear in ethical terms about this, to come from a position of humility and openness and flexibility, and an awareness of one's own limitations in an experiential sense, in an epistemological sense, and a flexibility to learn and to be corrected oneself. I would just sort of add that emphasis.
Shocker that a bunch of hardcore leftists who, spend all their time thinking and reading about this stuff would have a hard time with humility organizing with people. Yeah, right. The other thing really quick before we maybe dive into more of the concepts, I can't help but think about the Zapatistas with this, and that process of going to the hills, working with the indigenous peoples there, and how over that something like 10 to 15, maybe even 18-year-long process of slowly being there, learning with them, living with them, and how that fundamentally changed their conception of what it was to have a liberatory sort of project for their particular time and situation. And I just saw the other day, there's this great story that came out where they're still out there claiming new cities and townships under Zapatista control, like new municipalities, and they're still out there doing their thing. And Subcomandante Marcos, the very prominent figurehead of the Zapatistas, not too long ago, basically turned it over to the indigenous peoples themselves and said, "I'm done. It's their struggle. I'm out of here." So for me, I can't help but think about them, and whenever we're talking about this, and they seem to be an important case study to look into about some aspects of how these things could look about in a very specific organizing situation and context.
I think so. I think there's huge and important connections, and that's a great sort of model, and education for the Zapatistas has been a real core emphasis, and the schools in Chiapas have been so important to that struggle and so innovative in their organization, and I think Frary would be so pleased that project continues, right? We should also note, right, that there are some tensions, and in that there are folks who criticize Frary on the other side, right, for being too captured by a Western Marxist framework, and a kind of universalizing tendency that imagines essentially basic class dialectic, and that education and revolutionary work has to be thought in this framework and sort of proceeds along this historical path. And that, for instance, indigenous and non-Eurocentric perspectives might rattle somewhat this project and the philosophical basis of it, and so that we might think not just of a movement forward towards liberation, but of alternative pathways and other visions of what there is beyond capital and domination and racism, right? In other terms, I think Frary's work very much is open and allows for an engagement with those impulses, but there are also tensions too, I think.
I think that's helpful to think about too. It's always important to, I think, read something really generously and also read its criticisms very generously and put them in tension together.
Yeah.
One thing I'm curious about, I was wondering if we could talk about Frary's distinction between oppressor and oppressed and the way that the sort of banking model of education can shape the consciousness of those who are oppressed and lead them into certain forms of subjectivity or different ways of seeing the world. I found that to be a really powerful part of his work and something that's good for critical reflection.
Yes, absolutely. And also I think something that's really relevant today in a kind of new way in this moment. In some ways this is similar to other kind of Western Marxist ideas, for instance, of hegemony. From Gramsci, the idea that those who are at the bottom of the heap are taught to internalize, to produce a kind of consent to their own oppression and to allow the system to continue without having to resort to coercion, right? So, but the difference is that for Freire, it's much more dramatic in a way, coming from the Brazilian context of a kind of deep pathologization, a denial of the humanity, of the agency, of the value of people that colonialism produces, and that the relationships, the sort of plantation relationships of the ranchers and the workers crystallized in the context he was working from, and the structure of capitalism in that context and through the educational process isn't just sort of domesticating people, but actually dehumanizing and doing a kind of violence to folks. And so there's an immobilization, you might say, of consciousness and agency and historical possibility. And so really in engaging in education, people are not just changing their political views, but they're emerging into a kind of subjectivity in a historical sense and in a human sense that has been denied to them by the oppressor class through the systems of education and otherwise. And education is so key in this regard because it can begin this process of allowing people to investigate and to find for themselves a different relationship to their surroundings and to the social situation they find themselves in, and to understand their own historical power and agency as human beings, individually and collectively.
Yeah, so it's this way that this banking model of education has either arrested the development of that or limited or stunted its development. And unless this is really clear to listeners, that was the model of education I grew up with. So I feel like that is the dominant mode under capitalist modes of production and everything else.
The idea that the teacher and the school knows and the student knows nothing, as he puts it. Right now, what's really important, I think, in our context is to recognize that can show up in different ways. That can show up in a very sort of brutish and authoritarian manner, right?
Yeah.
In which, shut up and sit down and I have the answers. Or it can show up in a very friendly, progressive-seeming guise of group work and lots of fun and play, but we're going to do. But why are we going to do that? We're going to do those activities to arrive at the knowledge that we have decided ahead of time is what counts, right? So he's talking about a fundamental political and epistemological position, not just a narrow set of methods, which is a mistake sometimes people make. Sometimes people think in education, right? Sometimes people think, banking education, that means when I do a lecture and I don't talk to the students, right? As if it was a narrow question of methods, when what he's really talking about is a much more basic philosophical and ethical orientation. Whether I'm lecturing or whatever I'm doing, am I offering what I'm offering in the spirit and as part of a dialogue with people that is open to conversation and to collaborative construction of the truth, and also towards an unveiling of reality and of forms of oppression. I think that distinction is important, but absolutely, I think we're very much dominated by a banking form of education, especially in a new way now in the neoliberal kind of context, full-throated, right, scripted curriculum and endless standardized testing, and it's sort of on steroids, where the very space for any kind of unscripted and deeper conversation there's an effort to eliminate that. So there's a powerful urgency for Frary's work in that regard. On the other hand, I think the oppressor-oppressed model is also relevant in the very current moment, right, where we're seeing a return to certain forms of kind of naked violence and repression that his model also responds to. In other words, violence and capital accumulation and educational prescription and dehumanization are all moments for him of an overall system of oppression. And so he provides a framework in which we can make sense of some of the things we're experiencing now in a deeper way without resorting to the very narrow kind of vocabulary and political horizon that we get from the liberal perspective that, just calculates it in terms of who's the best candidate, right, to beat Trump or whatever. He points us to the underlying historical formations and the twists and turns of elite strategies of the ruling class in relation to regular people that is, I think, very useful.
There's something that comes to mind, too, just since we're touching on the ethical and philosophical points. I'm reminded of Lacan's idea of university discourse and almost like the name of the father, how there's this way that power functions in this softened sort of way to say, we are the ones who know. And it is this very powerful, deeply psychological impact that this has, that we all want to be recognized by people who claim this sort of mantle of knowledge and truth. And also at the same time, there's always the fist waiting behind it if someone doesn't acquiesce to that in a way. I'm also reminded as well, and this is definitely something I experienced in school, and especially, in higher education, where it's this way of saying, okay, everyone's going to engage in this process of free play and freedom, of group work and getting to define your own project and pick your topic. But at the end of the day, you're still being evaluated based on the knowledge that they want you to obtain at the end of the program. And, in my background in social work, that's very much primarily to be a very efficient, as well prepared as possible person to help keep these institutions in this Gramscian sort of sense functioning and to preserve relations of power, particularly between oppressor and oppressed groups. And I think that's one of the things that always struck me as really powerful is feeling the very real concrete effects of this, in my own life growing up, but also, in higher education, and realizing what it would have been like to engage in a different style of education, like what it would have been like and the effect it would have had on my life growing up to be part of this different way of receiving education and learning and developing knowledge together with, other people and teachers.
That's a great question, and I'm reflecting on it myself in relation to my own education, because I think that's really true. Even in the most sort of progressive and open moments, it's very rare, I think, that you see the kind of engagement that he was imagining, in the kind of, choose your own project and anything goes. Well, what happens if you choose a project to investigate the political determinations of the institution? There's limits to what is supposedly a free space, right? So, but it's also, the other important point here, I think, is, and this is also overlooked, he was very influenced also by critical theory in the Frankfurt School and the concern about the kind of creeping capitalist instrumentalization and bureaucratization and disenchantment of society, right, from Weber and all. So that the threat is not just from sort of a right authoritarianism, but from a liberal, condescending, and paternalistic, what he called false generosity represented in the institutions of, social work and education and social services of all kinds. Yeah. And what he called false generosity was an effort to help assist and ameliorate in a way that fundamentally insisted on and reproduced the same underlying social and political relationships and economic relationships, in which, of course, that's still the issue, right? So at the same time, in political terms, right, at the same time as we struggle against, proto-fascism and Trumpism, we're not aiming to go back to sort of the warm neoliberal embrace of the Democratic Party or something, right? And this is very useful in a practical way for educators, right? Mm-hmm. Because when he talks about politics and an engagement, a political commitment as a teacher, he doesn't mean let's talk about who's running for president, right? He means let's talk about the historical moment we're in. Let's talk about the struggles that people are facing. Let's talk about the antagonistic interests. And so it's more meaningful in a political sense, and it's also much more meaningful in an intellectual, educational sense, because you're really teaching and learning that much more. You're getting, again, to what he called generative themes, which is to say the topics and moments where political forces and their antagonisms crystallize and are experienced by people. We think of immigration or environmental destruction in our current moment, and those have sort of global registers and also more local registers, and that's the political work of teaching to engage folks in a deep investigation and analysis of those kinds of themes and how they affect us.
Noah, are you trying to tell me that memorizing dates of the American Revolution and Civil War is not engaging with history through generative themes? Is that what you're saying to me right now?
Now we need to be careful here, right? Because he wasn't saying, and this is something that later critical pedagogues have also emphasized, he wasn't saying that those kinds of technical knowledge were unimportant, right?
Yeah, I think that's really key.
But I think to take the spirit of your question, yes, just memorizing lists of dates decontextualized, is not only, of very limited educational value, but is also it's oppressive, right? It's oppressive as a sort of cognitive, emotional, spiritual exercise for students because it doesn't engage them as thinkers. It subverts their understanding of politics to a detached and distant set of facts that they don't get to debate, right? So, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't learn that information in the course of our right. And so that's also really important. That technical knowledge can be very useful and necessary, but it's in the process of a much deeper kind of engagement.
It makes me think too. It's really important just in our own context, being out there wanting to engage in political work now, that whenever we find this almost reaction or reflex in ourselves to shirk away from reading, from studying, from understanding history, from thinking through philosophical and ethical problems, to understand that this is maybe a very real, I think you said it beautifully, I've never thought of it this way, this sort of like cognitive, emotionally, spiritually oppressive response that we've learned precisely because we've been so thoroughly ingrained in this banking model of education. And it is important to see that as a side of struggle as well. I feel like I've always seen that as a side of struggle.
Yes, and this project here is such a great example of that, where it's a radical experiment in teaching and learning outside the confines.
There you go.
So
I might want you to give me a blurb or write that down. So
there you go.
That with people.
There you go. But it's true that there's a strain of anti-intellectualism and anti-theory that amazingly pervades sometimes the university itself, right? I mean, in the United States, there's a strong trend of positivism and empiricism, and not to mention education and teaching and teachers. Frary insisted on teachers as intellectuals, and we discount too readily the possibility of folks engaging with deep theory and deep philosophical and political questions that is both condescending to regular people and, also really cutting off our nose despite our face, because we need the thinking of everybody. And that's another thing that Frary's work sort of calls out, is an anti-intellectualism that can also be internalized, right? I mean, it can be internalized. Now, that doesn't mean that he was equally intent on emphasizing that you don't just spout things, right? People, but you come to people where they are, and you engage with people in language that they are familiar with, and build from there, as you are also, say, as a teacher, educated in the process in what folks can teach and what their concerns are. But he asks us to engage with theory. He asks us to engage intellectually in a very serious way if we're going to be not just philosophers, but if we're going to be teachers, or if we're going to be social workers, or if we're going to be organizers.
I can't help but think about Antonio Gramsci's idea that every person has this capacity to be a philosopher in some sort of sense, and they are, whether they realize it or not. And I can't help but wonder if you'd agree with this, that whenever we find ourselves thinking in this way that, theory and philosophy and thinking about ethical problems, these aren't things that most people care about or engage in, we're buying into this deeply ingrained anti-intellectualism, and also maybe reinforcing this oppressor-oppressed distinction in the way that knowledge and seeing yourself as someone who actively engages in these types of things, we're sort of playing into that, and that's something we've also internalized if we find ourselves thinking and feeling that way.
Yeah, I think there's sort of two ways it's expressed. One is a banking model, in Frary's terms, where people don't know and they need to be told, and there's no use in engaging in theoretical discussion, right? You need to deliver the right information. But the other is a sort of also, I think there's also an anxiety, say, among activist groups and also among educators, that we don't have time for it because we've got to get these things done. We have to get XYZ done, and so we can't allow ourselves, the freedom to take this time, or even, and I think this is interesting to think about psychoanalytically.
Yeah.
We can't allow ourselves the pleasure. We can't allow ourselves the liberatory experience of imagination and of theory and of philosophy, and engaging with these key questions that are so important, really, to us all. We are sometimes, in a kind of self-flagellating way, you might say, attached to a sort of joyless vision of what it means to be an educator or an activist, and which is not only damaging but counter-revolutionary ultimately, right? So Frary insisted this was a joyful. This should be a joyful. Joy is an important aspect of this work, and there has to be a space for imagination. So I think that there's many levels in which we make that mistake.
Damn, that gave me legitimate goosebumps hearing you say that. I think you hit on something really key. It's this idea that if we're feeling that joy of the imagination, the liberatory process, we're not feeling burned out and guilty and burdened down with the weight of oppression in the world, that somehow we're not hitting some deeply ethical or moral sort of criteria of what it means to be revolutionary.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, we got to change that. I think that's...
And it's also true for teachers, right? So teachers, as they struggle to kinds of curriculum and pedagogy that are empowering and affirming and liberating for students, also need to struggle for themselves, for the space and the resources and the time to imagine these new ways of teaching and thinking. And that's why the teacher unions are and their struggles and teacher movements are so important to critical pedagogy too. So Frary insisted on that also. Yeah,
and it makes me think about my own work with organizing with social workers, that what we're trying to carve out is not just better wages, better health care, lower caseloads, but we're trying to actively carve out more space for liberation, for being able to engage in this process for not just our sake, but for everyone's sake. It's part of what we have to fight for.
Yes, very much so.
No, I know that. I feel like we've maybe covered a lot of the things in the book. Is there any last concepts or important things from this work in particular that you want to make sure that someone takes away from listening to this episode?
Well, I think maybe there's a couple things I would underline, okay? So one it's a sort of, it can be abstract, but it can also be quite practical, is the insistence on Frary against a fatalistic orientation on the part of regular people and those struggling in solidarity with folks. And this is, I think, worth noting and emphasizing because there's a very deep tendency, again, in North America, I think, to have this sense that as we, for instance, as we engage in our activist work around the edges, we commit ourselves or we do our teaching, but underneath we sort of no, we believe it's not really going to change anything. Really.
Yeah.
And Frary is saying that's a mistake. That's a political mistake, and it's also a historical kind of mistake because, and this is why the philosophical vision is very liberating and useful, I think. If we see the work we're doing within the long arc of a humanizing project of liberation, a project of revolution in the deepest sense, right? You know, not just sort of narrowly political, but spiritual and cultural, then we can recognize within his vision that the efforts of the oppressors and the rulers to stymie that and to distort that is defensive, is a deviation, right? You know, a kind of turning away, which is not to say, you know, that any revolution is automatic, but is a turning away from a basic kind of humanity so that we can be hopeful, not in the simple sense that, I'm confident that the revolution is going to happen next month, but we can be hopeful on the foundation that this is basic to what it means to be a human being, to what it means to be with other people, and that those who would work against that and who would dehumanize and do violence for the sake of their own greed and distorted understanding of what it means to be happy and to be powerful are themselves internally oppressed and dehumanized, and that the path that we're all on is to open up possibility, and so that we can take heart from that. And history has shown so many victories and steps forward, even as there are also steps back, but that we're engaging in work that's not just narrowly partisan, but is about what it means to be alive and to embrace life and our humanness. And in that sense, it's quite hopeful and encouraging against the kind of fatalism that we often have, especially in this historical moment, I would say, right? I mean, it's worth remembering. And then the other thing I would just say is, the other thing just to call up again is this idea of problem posing, just as we do our work as educators and activists, that we think about it in terms not of, we're so obsessed always with finding the answer.
Yeah.
If we know the answer, maybe handing it out to other people. And if we don't know the answer, asking other people to tell us what it is so that we can. But he's saying, no, it's not that. It's how can we be engaged in confronting the problems together and thinking about where they come from and thinking about how we might struggle against the kinds of violence and oppression that we face and begin to make movement happen and learn in the process, much more than uncovering the recipe that's going to, tell us the right way to go or the right answer, but a collaborative process of teaching and learning together. And that sense, I think, can also be liberating to us in our work, not feeling anxious that we must know at every step and have the answers, but recognize that we're always learning, and that's really what's revolutionary.
Yeah.
Is that we create the opportunity for becoming and learning together. That's the revolutionary moment itself that we should strive for, not at some distant date, but right now. And I think that's a useful reminder also.
Yeah, I almost get the sense that the message to take is that revolution is not a product, it's not a commodity, it is a process. And the question is, are we engaging in revolution as a process or as a product that we're trying to fashion in some sort of way?
That's a great way to put it. Yeah.
Maybe one last thing I'll say, and I think that you're right. At this historical moment, in a place with, this phase of neoliberal capitalism, ecological catastrophe, the amount of despair and the lack of hope that we feel, I think that what we all sort of are wanting deep down is someone to give us answers about what to do and how to stop this. And the real challenge, the real radical move I think we're trying to flesh out here is that it isn't about getting a certain answer. It is about engaging in this process, and that is what is always going to be revolutionary and radical, and that's what we have to think about.
That's right, because we know, just in very practical terms, experts can deliver answers to folks on high, but that's not going to change anything. What's going to actually make change is when everybody decides to get involved in working towards a different way of being to begin with, and then things are going to start to move forward, and not before then, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think that's absolutely right.
Well, I don't know, any final parting thoughts, reflections?
Well, no, just it's a pleasure to engage in the conversation, and I hope people will take up Freire Pedagogy of the Oppressed and other stuff that he wrote, and it's really so useful for not just folks in education, but in all different fields, and really will get you thinking.
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone has a lot to learn from him. And one other thing that comes to mind to leave listeners with is that a book that he wrote later, I think at the end of his life, was called Pedagogy of Freedom, and thinking about shifting towards that model, and also, books that Bell Hicks, the amazing, feminist activist scholar, has written about teaching community and teaching hope, and, understanding that this is an educational process that we're all, we are participating in, and thinking about how do we teach towards those things and help people tap into that revolutionary process. I mean, you can think of a more important thing that we all need, I think, in our lives right now.
Yes, I agree with you. And I think that politically speaking, to take up this tradition, and as you say, not just Frary, but bell hooks and many others who are interested in, critical and radical and more open approaches to teaching and learning, that this could be really useful, politically speaking, to engage more centrally with the pedagogical educational dimension. Yeah.
Well, I think on that note, I will say I can never thank you enough for coming on the show, not just once, but twice, taking time out of your busy schedule. It is truly an honor to have you on here and help bring your voice and your experience and ideas to the guests.
Well, it's a real privilege to talk with you, and I think you've got a great series going, and this is the kind of work that we need at this moment, so I really appreciate it.
All right. Well, on that note, Comrade listeners, Comrade Noah, thanks so much for tuning in. Thanks for being here, and I guess we'll see you all next time. All right, y'all. That's a wrap for part 2 of Red Library's Revolutionary Politics in Central and South America series. We hope you really enjoyed this one. This one was a true pleasure, a true honor for me, so big shout out, big thanks to Comrade / Professor Noah de Lissovoy for joining us on the show yet again this week. And hopefully he'll be back at another point. He has such a wealth of knowledge and beautiful ways of imagining, of thinking through the relationship between Marxist politics and anti-colonial, post-colonial theory and social movements in Central and South America. He has a lot to bring to the show. So I'll have him on here as often as he'll agree to it. We'll see you back here next week for the next installment of Red Library, a political education podcast for today's left. In the meantime, remember to keep supporting the show, subscribe, share the show with friends, comrades, potential comrades, reactionaries, family members. I'm sure there's probably a Venn diagram there of how all those kind of overlap, but just start sharing the show with whoever. All right, remember to head over to Patreon, get signed up, throw us a few bucks. Again, for as little as $3 a month, you'll get access to our exclusive patron-only content coming your way starting at the end of this month. Again, huge shout out, huge thanks to all of our patrons that have been supporting what we do, giving us great feedback, asking great questions, sending us suggestions for future episodes. We're really excited about that. It really, really makes us feel very proud of the work that we do and very humbled to be able to bring our project, our reading, our thinking, our shit talking, all of that stuff to you each and every week. We couldn't do it without you. I'll dispense with the other ways to support the show. You know what to do. If you're a regular listener, you've heard me say this every single week. But I'm going to keep saying it because we're getting more and more listens from all over the world with each new episode, and we want to make sure we keep building our revolutionary base. In the spirit of the end of our conversation today with Comrade / Professor Noah de Lissovoy, remember to keep those imaginations strong and functioning in your political work. Just remember that despair and that sort of nihilistic self-flagellation is not a sign of true revolutionary subjectivity and character, and in many ways, it potentially could be counter-revolutionary and undercutting the very thing that we seek to build together. Keep those lights burning, keep that joy alive, and we'll see you back here next week. Red Library out. Peace.